Well, hello everybody, and welcome back after a little bit of a break to our journey down the road to somewhere. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, maybe so that you can go through the New Testament with us, we want to welcome you. And we are starting what you might think of as a new season as we move into a new state. And we are also starting into a very significantly new part of the Bible that begins with that state, all of which we'll talk about a little bit later. For those of you that are new, I thought I might just give a brief explanation of what we're up to. And using my latest book, The Road to Somewhere, as sort of a map, we're actually on a trip with John Calvin, who was the protagonist in the book Somewhere Fast. So he's the main character in this new book, along with a videographer named Joy Jardine. And they've actually been hired to travel down Route 66 from Chicago to LA and film a series of short videos that actually hook up with a teaching series of 66 lectures on the 66 books of the Bible. And we'll talk a little bit about how all that works later. But Route 66 passes through 8 states. And let me go up here just a second and show you, if I can come to a map. I'll come back to this. It goes through 8 states, and what I've done is there are really 8 major sections of the Bible, and so what we've done is correlated each state with one of those major sections of the Bible, and each state is like a season. So again, we're in season 5. And each season then contains the number of episodes that pair up with the number of biblical books that are in each section. So again, so far we've been through 4 states and all 4 major sections of the Old Testament. We've made 36 stops, and John Calvin and along with myself have given a brief introduction on the shorter videos to all 39 books of the Old Testament. Basically, what I started out to do was just kind of tell you what he says in the book, in each chapter of the book, about that specific book that's paired up. And some of them he doesn't say a lot, so I've added a little bit to that so that you get a pretty good little brief introduction to each book. And then we've again gone through all 39 books of the Old Testament. And the objective being, and this was the objective of writing the book, by the way, is then to encourage you to go to the link that will put you in touch with a teaching video about the specific book that kind of pairs up with the stop that we've made. I'll go back here for a second because today we're going to cross over into the state of Texas, Oklahoma obviously being our last state, and this will be season 5. And in Texas, this, by the way, I think is actually the spot where Route 66 passes from Oklahoma into Texas. And then again, when we get here into Texas, basically Route 66, it runs through the panhandle of Texas. Even though Texas is the biggest or the largest state that Route 66 runs through, it only runs through this little area of 178 miles that we consider to be the panhandle of Texas. And what we're going to do is we're going to hook up then the 4 stops will move into the Gospels, which will be what is paired up with the state of Texas. We'll have 4 stops that have to do with the 4 gospel accounts of the life of Jesus. And again, this is the beginning of the New Testament then. The approach that we're going to take is a little different than what we've done in the Old Testament just for these 4 books. 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, cover a lot of common ground. And if we just went through them as books, what I've found is that there's just a lot of repetitive material. And rather than approaching it that way, what we're going to do, and what's done also in the teaching videos, is that we're going to divide the life of Jesus up into 4 sections. And then we're going to harmonize, what's called harmonizing the Gospels, which means we'll take the pieces from each of the 4 Gospels that kind of fit in chronologically into the flow of the life of Jesus, and we'll highlight one part in each of the 4 videos. So today we're heading toward Shamrock, Texas will be our first stop in Texas. Quite a bit different, by the way, than our last stop, Texola, which was pretty much a ghost town. Shamrock has been able to withstand the interstate bypassing them, and have actually been able to utilize and build upon the fact that they were a big stop on Route 66. And so we'll use the book of Mathew as sort of here we go, welcome to Shamrock, and I'll go back. We'll use the book of Mathew as sort of our basic text. And so John and Joy in the book, they pull into Shamrock in their Resto Mod 66 Corvette convertible. If you haven't been with us, their car is almost like a character in the book, and becomes even more so as we move along. A couple of fun stops where people really kind of converge upon the car, and John and Joy use that in their story. So they pull into Shamrock, and again, Shamrock tries to utilize its Route 66 nostalgia. It has a population of about 1,800 people, which is actually only half of what the population was at its peak. And in the book, they decide to go out to dinner at Big Vern's Steakhouse. And in this particular chapter of the book, they get into an interesting discussion, and I thought I would just touch upon that briefly, about the Old Testament. They finish the Old Testament, and John makes the observation that he feels like the Old Testament is kind of dismal, which I think is true, by the way. Joy points out that actually, the book ends with the temple and the city being rebuilt, and that from her perspective, the tone isn't quite as dismal. But that leads into the sort of this discussion that they have about how many people actually know the Old Testament well enough to understand something about the tone. And John observes that it would be interesting, an interesting statistic to know what percentage of Christians know what percentage of the Bible. And he has a relatively pessimistic view about that, and he guesses that about 20% of the Christian population know about 10% of the Bible. And Joy responds that that's a little bit mind-boggling, since everything we know about Christ and about Christianity really comes from the Bible, and that most people that believe in Jesus don't have much of a grasp upon at least most of the scriptures. John also points out, by the way, that even fewer have any idea how we got the Bible and how the documents that it contains came about. And so they have this discussion. It's chapter 39, if you want to go back and read it, because it's pretty interesting. It has some good material in it. But they decide that what they're going to do here, as they've gotten to Shamrock, is they're going to wait till the next morning. They've checked into their hotel. And then the next morning, they've decided that they're going to shoot the video in front of the restored U-Drop Inn. Used to be a filling station and a cafe, and now it actually houses the Chamber of Commerce of Shamrock, and I think there's a little museum in there too. So the next morning they kind of pull up under that portico. You see a little Mustang convertible in this picture, but if you can imagine a red Corvette convertible under there, you'd have a good idea of the setting of their video. And in the video, John begins by telling the audience a little bit about Shamrock and points out the U-Drop Inn. And he also talks about the fact that if it looks familiar to some of you that have never seen it in person or in picture, that this was the building that actually inspired Ramon's House of Body Art in the movie Cars. And so if you see some familiarity, that might be what you're thinking about. Then he talks a bit about how moving into Texas starts the part of the journey through the New Testament. He gives a brief overview in this little video, and it's in the chapter of the book, about what's happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you aren't familiar with it, there have been 4 centuries that have passed since the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, and the world has changed a lot during those 400 years. There have been a number of empires that have conquered each other. We ended the Old Testament with the Persian Empire having conquered the Babylonian Empire, and as the Old Testament comes to a close, Israel is really a vassal state of the Persian Empire. What we don't see, because when we get to the New Testament, it opens up and Israel is a vassal state of the Roman Empire. And in between those periods of time, Alexander the Great has conquered the world and conquered the Persian Empire. He dies and his empire is divided up among 4 of his generals. And they are then conquered in 63 BC by Pompey and the Romans. And so again, the New Testament opens with Israel now under the control of the Roman empires. He goes on to kind of explain how they're going to approach the 4 Gospels in the manner in which I have told you, and that to begin using the Gospel of Mathew and actually some of Luke also, but that this first section of the life of Christ is going to deal with the early years of Jesus. John actually points out that Mathew is one of 2 books that talk about the birth of Jesus. The other is Luke's Gospel. To really get a full idea, particularly of the Nativity, you really have to combine those 2 books together. There's nothing in Mark about the birth of Christ. It really begins with John the Baptist, and there's really nothing in John. John kind of really begins, in a sense, taking Jesus back to prior to the creation of the universe, as he refers to him as the Logos. But in terms of the actual events of the early life of Jesus, you really have to go to either Matthew or Luke. In the little video, as John is shooting it, he also tells them that the lecture on this particular part of the life of Jesus really explores 4 what you might think of as major events in the early life of Jesus. The first, of course, being the birth narrative, which again is contained both in Matthew and Luke. Of course, we celebrate that when we celebrate Christmas. Might be interesting for you to know that because of the fact that really no one knew the exact date of the birth of Christ, that the early church in the first few centuries really didn't celebrate the birth of Jesus. And it wasn't till around the 4th century when they began to observe what was called the Feast of the Nativity. And again, they picked December 25th. There's a bit of debate on why they picked that date. Some believe that they picked the date because it gave Christians something to celebrate rather than celebrating the pagan festival of Saturnalia, which took place right around December 25th, marking the winter solstice. So there's different reasons why. We're pretty sure that Jesus wasn't born in December, probably born in springtime, since shepherds were out watching their fields at night, and oftentimes that meant that it was the time of the year when sheep were giving birth to their babies. And so probably I would say the consensus is that the actual date of Christ's birth is probably in the springtime, but nonetheless we celebrate it on December 25th. So the birth narrative is part, and if you watch the lecture on this particular part of the life of Christ, which I encourage, you will get to see more about the birth narrative. I think that the scriptures actually are different than the way we celebrate it, and there are a lot of little details that are kind of fun to know. So anyway, you'll have to watch the teaching video to see a little bit more about that. And then also, at this point, in terms of the early years of Jesus, on the 8th day after his birth, he was taken to the temple to offer the dedication that was required for every male child. And at the temple, some interesting things happened. Jesus is both an older gentleman by the name of Simeon, gives some prophecy about the baby, and an older prophetess named Anna also does. So that's a pretty significant little piece of his early childhood. We also have in the early years, and I believe this might only be in Matthew, the coming of the Magi. Again, our sense or what our experience has been is that we normally see the baby and the family in a kind of a barn or a grotto, and that the wise men show up the night he's born. Actually, we think they didn't come for 2 years, and part of that is because of what happened when they reported to Herod that they had first seen the star that led them there 2 years ago. And when they come to Jesus, the text specifically says that they come to see him in a house. So it's, the actual text is different than what we traditionally celebrated. And it's the warning that comes through the wise men about Herod's intentions that then encourage Joseph and Mary and Jesus to head down to Egypt. We don't know a lot about that period of time. There's been a lot of speculation. Some books have been written about Jesus turning clay birds into real birds, and just stories that have come up through the history that probably didn't happen. We don't know how long exactly they were there, but they stayed there until Herod died. And Herod died, and there's debate about this, but for most of the last few centuries, the date of Herod's death has been set at 4 BC, which means that Jesus had to have been born prior to that, and that his time in Egypt was probably relatively short, maybe a year or two, which would have put his birth at 6 BC. And they would have then left Egypt when Herod died, and they head back, and we're told they head back to the town of Nazareth. The only other incident we have in the early life of Jesus is really at the age of 12, where we're told that when the family travels down from Nazareth to Jerusalem for one of the great feasts, that Joseph and Mary begin heading home, thinking Jesus is with them somewhere in the group that's heading back to Nazareth, and they realize that he isn't. And they go back, they spend 3 days searching Jerusalem for him, and then they finally find him at the temple, interacting at 12 years of age with the elders of Israel. And he's really, at the age of 12, has quite an awareness, I think, of who he is. He refers to the temple as his father's house. And you have this, event that takes place, and then really there's a bit of silence about him in the texts until he's about 30 years old. The teaching video actually contains his baptism at the age of 30, which I think I probably would have placed, if I had to rethink it, would have placed more into his early ministry, because it's what really launches him into ministry at the age of 30. We'll be looking at that early ministry in our next session together. So finally, John just encourages his audience to watch that teaching video on Mathew, reminds them that there is also, as if you've been getting my emails, there is an entire session, a lecture that I gave on that period of time called the intertestamental period between the end of the Old Testament and the New and the beginning of the New. So there's an extra video in there that, again, you should have a link to if you haven't watched it so far. And then in the story, John and Joy sort of pack up and begin heading again across the 178 miles of the Texas Panhandle. And their second stop is going to be McLean, Texas. And the part of Jesus' life that we'll be looking at then is really kind of his early ministry from the time of his baptism and through about 18 months that he spends primarily up in the region of Galilee. And we'll be looking at all of that next week in our time together. So we're off again, we're running, we're in the New Testament, we're in Texas, and we're glad to have you along for the ride, and we will see you then next week.